Hey everyone, welcome to another Avid tutorial. This is a quick tutorial on export settings. I'll note I have some other tutorials that do go through the export process in some more detail. I have one that's specifically about changing aspect ratio and frame sizes and stuff like that. I'll put links to all those down at the bottom where you can find them. What I want to talk about specifically here is some of the export settings dealing with codecs and format, because I've noticed that's something a lot of people, at least my experience with students, tend to get confused about. I thought it might be helpful to just clarify this a little bit if that's ever been something that's confused you. So I'm really going to focus on that. If you want the full how to export and all the details and all the steps, check out one of the other tutorials. So I have down here a sequence. It's very short, about 10 seconds and just one clip, because the point of this isn't the sequence, it's just how to actually export it. So I've got this window selected, or I could select the sequence here in my bin, either way. And I'll go to Output, Export to File. And I have all these different export settings here. So something I would suggest if you're working on a computer that you're going to be working on a lot. So I'm on my laptop right now. I wouldn't necessarily do this in a lab setting where I might be on a different computer every day and may not always have the same user settings. These are part of my user settings, and you can create all sorts of presets. And that way you don't have to go through figuring out these details every time. So you see, I've found a lot of different things depending on what I know I might need an export for, that I've already preset these, so I don't have to go through all the details every time. I can just select what I want, and I know that that's set up the way I want it. In this case, I'll just go to this default one called Send to QuickTime Movie. And an important reminder that these names don't necessarily correspond to what is actually happening. You have to look at the settings, unless it's a setting that you've created yourself, like some of these, which again are tied to your user profile, and are sure that those do what they want. So I'm going to go in there and go into my options here. And what I wanted to talk about here is just a couple of these key settings. There's kind of three different things that determine how this is being exported. I'm going to focus here in the video, although this can apply to the audio as well. And so the first one is what sort of format we're exporting it as. The second one is the codec family that it's in. And the third one is the actual specifics of that codec, the specific version of it that we're using. And I was trying to come up with a good analogy for this, and I don't know if I have a great one, but I'm going to give it a shot and kind of relate it to grocery shopping. So this first one, the export as, is basically like, what's the container that we're going to put this in? And so you can imagine, let's say you're going to the grocery store and getting stuff. If you had like a mesh bag or something, you could put some apples in there, some potatoes. There's different types of things that can go in there, but you're not going to put milk in it, right? Because the milk will just leak out. Milk needs to go in some sort of a jug or container. On the flip side, if I had like a gallon jug like you would get milk in, I can get other things in there. I can get orange juice or something, but I'm not going to get like a grapefruit in a gallon jug. So the actual container that you're putting this in determines sort of what you could put in there. What are some of my options? The crucial thing here is this export as. This is not a codec. And students get confused on this a lot. They're like, well, I exported it as a QuickTime because they have this set to MOV. I'm like, okay, well, what was in that QuickTime? And they don't know. And so what you want to be aware of is this here is telling me what's the container that I'm putting this in. And that's going to affect what things I could put in. Like I said in my grocery analogy, if I had a big jug, I could put orange juice, I could put milk in it, I could put lemonade, but I can't put apples. I can't put spaghetti. Whereas if I selected, cardboard box, well, I could put some pasta in there. Maybe I could put some fruits or something in there, but I can't put liquid in. I'm not going to put cream cheese in a cardboard box. I know it kind of comes in a cardboard box with foil inside it, but work with me here. So this is my first thing, is just what's the container? And as I said, that's going to affect what options I have for types of codec and other details below this, but it's not the actual codec itself. This is just what box am I putting things in. So the MOV, the sort of QuickTime wrapper that we're used to, there can be a lot of things in there. I can have things that are just audio. I can have things that are video. I can have things that are combinations of both. The fact that it's an MOV, all that's telling me is it's something that theoretically is some sort of audio, video, media that maybe QuickTime can play. And maybe it can, and maybe it can't, depending on some of the other choices I make. But that's the important thing here. And so I have a few different options, and just to kind of show you what happens, if I switch to something else, I'm going to switch this to an AAF, which is actually not just audio and video. This is information about the sequence and how it's put together. You notice all these options changed, and suddenly I don't have the same info about codecs and stuff, because this is actually exporting something kind of different. But even if I go to other things that are audio video files, so let's say I want to do it as an MXF OP1A, okay, I can do this, and you can see I have some compression options here. I have selected that I'm doing the video. I have some stuff about the audio, but the options look different because, again, I'm putting it in a different container, so there's different choices about what I could put in there. If I set it to an MP4, which is sort of like the default for an MPEG-4 container, again, that's going to give me some options of what I could try to put inside that. This is going to look pretty similar to MOV, although I'll have some slightly different things. So in this case, I'm just going to go to an MOV. my sort of standard QuickTime option. And so that's my container. Then the other two decisions I have to make here are the codec family and then the specific compression. So family is, think of a big range of things that are all basically using the same engineering scheme under the hood. They're kind of compressing the video the same way. And so when we talk about a codec, all a codec means is it's some way that we've represented that video as zeros and ones, right? We're translating it into binary so the computer can read it. And there's some way that that picture has to get translated into computer data. Again, zeros and ones. We don't need to know the details of exactly what's happening under the hood, how that's being done. We just need to know the codec is the way that that is being done. And so these different families are different ways this can be done that have different overall advantages and disadvantages. And I'm not going to get into defining all the codecs and stuff here, but for example, Apple ProRes and DNxHD and DNxHR, these are all what's called intermediate codecs, these kind of three right here. And these are things that are designed for working in post-production. They are going to have every frame individually encoded, which makes it easier on your computer when you're editing in the middle of a clip and editing to the middle of another clip, as opposed to some other formats that get better compression, meaning they can fit the same quality into smaller file sizes, or the same perceptible quality at least, because they can code groups of frames together. And this works very well for what we call distribution codecs, things that are meant to be finished products. The movie's done, I'm going to upload it to YouTube or send it to a friend. Small file size with high quality. And in many cases, these distribution codecs can do that because they're encoding groups of frames together. So for example, it might have one frame encoded in its entirety, and then for the next frame, instead of re-encoding all those pixels, it says, hey, basically just do the same thing as the last frame, except change these few pixels over here. So if you have like long static shots, these can be really efficient codecs, but they can be harder in editing to deal with because you might cut to the middle of a shot and your computer needs to say, okay, I got to start on this frame. Okay, there's not actually data for this frame. It says, see this thing that happened 10 frames ago, and I have to like recalculate all the previous 10 frames just to figure out what's going to be in this frame. That can be a little rougher editing wise. So anyway, Apple ProRes, DNxHD, DNxHR, these are all things that are designed for while you're working in post-production. They can actually be used as sort of finishing quality codecs. A lot of times if I'm doing a master archive of a project at sort of the highest quality possible, like this is, if I ever need to go back and make new versions of this project in different formats, I'm going to transcode that master into it. So I kind of want maximum quality. I might use something like a high quality Apple ProRes or a DNxHD if it's HD media, or DNxHR if it's something higher than HD. Anyway. But these are all families. This is not telling me specifically exactly what encoding is in here. This is just like, what's the flavor of encoding? So if I want to go back to my grocery analogy, I got sent to the store and said like, okay, I'm going to get some apples. I'm not getting oranges. I'm not getting a grapefruit. I'm not getting potatoes. I'm not getting a pack of Reese's peanut butter cups. I'm getting apples. So that's kind of the family here, but that still doesn't tell me what apple, right? Because depending on what I am doing with them, maybe I want Granny Smith apples. Maybe I want a Honeycrisp apple. Maybe I want a Cosmic Crisp, which I just got turned on to, which are quite good. There's all these different varieties of apples that are in that same category, but just saying apple isn't going to tell me exactly what I'm getting. So this would be the family thing like that. So let's say I went to DNxHD. Now I get to the specific details. And so whatever my setting is here, it's going to show me different varieties or flavors of that. And again, if it's in the same family, they're basically doing the same thing. They're designed for the same purpose, and they're using the same overall sort of engineering and compression scheme, but they're different versions of that. So in the case of like the DNxHD family, these are all basically increasing levels of quality. So 444 is sort of my highest quality version of that. It's going to have the highest data rates. This might be good if I'm, again, using it as an archival version or something. DNxHD LB, the LB stands for low bandwidth. These are the smallest files of this particular codec family. And I use this all the time, actually. This is a great one for if I'm just doing my creative edit. It still looks fine. I've talked about this in other tutorials, but people worry about like, oh, it's compressing to this low bitrate thing. It's going to look terrible. I'm not going to be able to see the footage. It looks fine to your naked eye. You're probably not actually going to be able to see the difference in many cases between some of these, but I wouldn't use this as like my final mastering version of it where, maybe it's going to be projected on the big screen and I want maximum quality possible, but perfectly fine for creative edit and my smallest files. Just for an example, if we go to a different one, I'll go to Apple ProRes and you can see same kind of thing, a bunch of different varieties of this ranging from the sort of smallest sizes to the highest. Apple ProRes 422HQ in HD world is actually a pretty good one for finishing quality. This is something that like YouTube will actually accept, or Vimeo if you want to like upload it. They know how to process and read this, but it's very high quality, can be pretty large files, so you want to be careful of that. Obviously, if you're working with like, 4K media and you're using something like this, or God help you, 4444, which really you only use these if you're like in visual effects and in the middle of doing something and like, okay, I have this shot I need to export out to do some VFX on, or I'm going to be doing additional stuff to it, so I want to bring all the data possible with me. That's where I would use these. The extra 4 on the end here, you'll notice these all have 3 numbers, these ones have 4, is the alpha channel, which is actually something I only need for visual effects. It's not something that I need in a finished output media unless I'm trying to make some, transparent thing. Maybe it's a logo that I want people to download that can play over other media or something. So there might be times where you want to use that, but generally this is going to be unnecessary. Anyway, this is really good there. Again, if I'm doing like a creative offline edit, I would work with one of these smaller versions. And then we have, our classic things like H.264, and you can see there's different varieties of that, or H.265. And you can see here, I just have kind of 2 different versions of this in here. And again, this is telling me within this family, what's the specific version of the encoder that I'm doing. So to kind of reiterate, we got 3 things. First, we got the box we're putting it in. And you'll notice within QuickTime Movie, I had all these different things there could be. I'll tell you, one of the common things I get from students is they'll export something, let's say using one of the DNxHD codecs. Kind of doesn't matter which one, they'll get the same issue, and it'll come out as a QuickTime Movie, and they'll give it to someone like, hey, this should play in QuickTime Player, and it won't play. It'll say like, I can't read this media because QuickTime does not natively include the DNxHD codec. So you've put it in a box and said, hey, this is something that QuickTime could play. And if you have that codec properly installed on your computer, it can, but computers don't come with this codec natively installed, so it's just going to open up and not know how to play that video. And like, my video won't play, or I exported this thing and there's no video, it's just a blank screen. It's like, well, the data is there, it's just QuickTime Player doesn't know how to do it because you just said this, but forgot to look down here at what's happening here. So I've got my container, I've got the family, and then I've got the actual specific codec that I'm using. So that's the key thing I wanted to say. One other thing I'll just quickly note is on some of these, so in the case of like DNxHD, these are basically an increasing quality level, and you kind of just have these presets. I can't choose, I want something in between SQ and HQ. These are my choices. I can choose color depth if I want more or less. And again, depending on what I'm using this for and what the original media was, I may or may not get a benefit from choosing a higher bit depth. But on some codecs, so let me go to H.264 here for a second, and I'll just use the default H.264 version of this. I have some choice here where I can actually set like what's my target bit rate. And this is something you could actually calculate if you want. So I will say the default here is sort of maxing out at 20 megabits per second, which is way more than you need to make your video look fine. And it's just going to yield bigger files. I could actually do a calculation and say like, okay, let's say I have a 10-minute movie I'm trying to export and I want the file size to be small because I have to upload it somewhere and then re-download it somewhere else or whatever. Maybe I'm turning it in for a class. My professor's going to need to download it. This is something I run into all the time. And so I don't want to download, if somebody uploads their 10-minute movie and it's like 20 gigs, I'm like, no, re-export it differently and I'll download it then. I'm not going to download a 20 gig file for a 10-minute movie. That's unnecessary. So you can actually do some calculations on this. So let's say I had, like I said, a 10-minute movie and I said, I want it to be about 200 megabytes and I feel like that's a reasonable size. I could say, well, I want 10 minutes per 200 megabytes, and I could do some calculations to change megabytes into megabits and minutes into seconds. And I would figure out very quickly that what I actually need to get that 10-minute movie in like the 200 megabyte range is really something around here, about 2 2/3 megabits per second. And this will come out looking perfectly fine. One other thing I want to check here is my video levels. I'm not sure why Avid in some of these is defaulting to scale from legal to full range. Most of the time you don't want to do that. You want to keep it as legal range. There's certain situations where you do need to scale it. So one example would be if you're exporting something that's going into a DCP, you actually need to go into full range color space for that to work correctly. That's not the main purpose of this tutorial, so I'm not going to get into that. I will just say most of the time you want to select keep as legal range, and probably if you're in a situation where you need to change this, you'll know. Okay, so I'm going to do this and I'm going to have it at this fairly low bit rate. And I'm also going to change my bits per second, this is on the audio side, from 24 to 16. If I'm trying to keep this file size small, again, if this is kind of work in progress thing, I'm also just going to go to AAC instead of PCM. That's going to save me some data. Okay, so let's do this. And this was a short clip, only 10 seconds, so that'll export quickly. And just to show you what comes out, Okay, there was that video, and you'll notice even with that very low data rate, the picture still looked fine. So again, there's no need to be cranking this stuff out at 20 megabits per second. All that was going to do was make my file size 10 times bigger, and in terms of my perception, not make a huge difference. Again, if this is the final version of something, this is going to be the version I put up on the web or is screening in a theater or something, I might be a little more concerned about making sure I have maximum quality. But in most cases, I would say my experience with students is everyone tries to like export everything at like maximum quality and highest bitrate all the time, and it's just overkill, and all they're doing is generating gigantic files that are no better than if they had generated a file 1/10 the size. Your mileage may vary. That's just sort of my overall comment, is be aware of how big your file sizes are. Okay, so hopefully that clarifies some of the exporting stuff and what codecs and codec families and formats, or what I call wrappers, are. And next time you go to export, you have a little more control over those and know what you're doing and can choose the appropriate thing for your project. Hope that was helpful. See you next time.